The final method we're looking at is mixing norms. Now, people commonly make inferences from one normative area to another normative area. Normative areas are, roughly put, areas involving matters of value. These include law, religion, aesthetics, morality, and etiquette. People often believe that the status of something, let's call it X to stand for whatever it is we're talking about, in one normative area automatically gives it the same status in another normative area. For example, it is often assumed there is a moral right to free speech because of the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, which guarantees a legal right to the freedom of press. As another example, people sometimes infer that because they believe that same-sex marriage goes against their religious faith, it follows that it also must be immoral, and perhaps that it should be, therefore, illegal as well. Such inferences can be made, but must be made carefully if they're going to be well supported. Now, in terms of doing it in a way that is not well supported, there is the flawed method. It involves two flawed steps. Step 1 is to claim that X, whatever is being talked about, has status S in normative area Y. Flawed step 2 is that therefore X should have a comparable status to S in normative area Z. So the basic idea, to give some examples, is someone reasons like this. Lying to a friend is immoral, so therefore it should be illegal. Or capital punishment is legal, therefore it is morally acceptable. Another example, if your meter runs out before you can put in more money, then you are parked illegally. So you must also be parked immorally. Yet another example, Deuteronomy 21:18-21 says that children who do not obey their parents are to be stoned to death. So stoning to death disobedient children is therefore morally acceptable. And as a final example, depicting graphic violence and sexuality is morally wrong. Therefore, such works must also be aesthetically unacceptable. They must be bad art, or perhaps not even art at all. Now, this method is flawed, even fallacious, because using the flawed steps, the conclusion does not follow unless a proper link is made between area Y and area Z. So if someone again just simply says, well, lying to a friend is immoral, therefore it must be illegal, that would be rather too quick. What's needed is not an immediate leap from one area to another, but a correct movement or inference from one to another. And the correct method is this. Step 1. Establish that X has status S in normative area Y. Step 2. Present a premise or argument connecting area Y and normative area Z. And then in step 3, conclude that therefore X should have the comparable status to S in normative area Z. So in order to avoid engaging in poor reasoning, the correct method should be used. And provided that the connection between areas Y and Z is adequately made, the reasoning is good, acceptable. This is because the chain of reasoning is complete, unlike in the flawed method. Now, as it might be imagined, the first step will most likely require support of its own. As an example, this method could be used to argue for the claim that making backup copies of media should be legal. The first step would be to argue that making backup copies of DVDs, softwares, and CDs is morally acceptable. The second step would be to argue that things that are morally acceptable should also be legal. The conclusion drawn would be that making backup copies of DVDs, software, and CDs should thus be legal. Now, perhaps the most critical part of this method is making that connection between the two areas. And making such a connection between two normative areas can be difficult. Fortunately, there are ways to do this. The overall task is to show that the status of one thing, if I call it X, in one normative area Z, should be inferred from its status in normative area Y. One way to make this connection is to make use of an existing theory. There are theories that explicitly or implicitly connect two normative areas. For example, divine command theory is the view that morality is determined by religion, so the inference from religious norms to moral norms would be justified on the assumption that this theory is correct. As another example, legalism is the view that morality is determined by the laws of the state, so an inference from legal norms, the laws, to moral norms would be justified, again on the assumption that this legalism or legal positivism is a correct moral theory. To use an existing theory, one would simply use an argument from authority or an appeal to a moral theory to establish the reasoning. Now, another way to make the connection is to state that the argument is being made in the context of a particular theory, such as divine command theory or legal positivism. The obvious weakness of this approach is that only those who accept the theory will accept that inference. As an example, a person might claim that given divine command theory, since the Bible apparently permits torture, it follows that torture is morally acceptable. As another example, a person might argue that given legalism, since the use of marijuana is in many places illegal, it must also be evil, at least in those places. Another approach is to argue for the theory, which will typically require a great deal of work. However, it is possible to present a sufficiently concise argument in favor of the relevant parts of the theory needed to make that connection. However, if there is an easier or more direct way to argue for the conclusion, this sort of method can be overkill. Another way to make the connection is by arguing explicitly for a connection between the two that justifies the inference. The task is to show that the status of X in normative area Z should be inferred from its status in normative area Y. The effectiveness of this method depends on the quality of the argument for the connection. For example, a person might present the following argument, and here's how it goes. The state exists to protect people from harm. Thus, the laws of the state are designed to protect people from harm by making harmful things illegal. Things that are immoral are harmful. At the very least, they damage the person's moral character. Thus, things that are immoral should also be made illegal by the state. As a final point, given this method can involve a great deal of work, if there's an easier or more direct way to argue for the point being made, this method can be overkill. It can involve arguing way too much to establish way too little. Now suppose you're on the receiving end of mixing norms, or in the context of the paper, you presented a mixing of norms, and you want to raise an objection by countering your own method, and then of course responding back to that. One way to reply to this method is to challenge the normative status of X as presented in the first step, namely that X has status S in normative area Y. Challenging the status involves arguing that X does not have the alleged status. If X does not have the required normative status, then obviously the inference fails. Alternatively, this inference can be made, but the normative status would be based on this new status. For example, suppose someone argued that copying DVDs is immoral, and hence should be illegal. A response, in this context, would be to argue that copying DVDs is morally acceptable, and thus concluding that hence it shouldn't be illegal, that is to say, it should be legal. A second way to respond to this method is to try to break the link between the two areas. The argument depends on the link between the two normative areas, so if the link fails, the argument also fails. The objective is to argue that the inference is not justified. In some cases, there are established ways to break the link. For example, a stock way to counter an argument for basing law on religious views is to appeal to the separation of church and state, at least in the United States. The link can also be attacked by arguing that the norms of one area simply do not apply to the other, or that one area overrides another, thus preventing going from one area to another. For example, Oscar Wilde seems to have claimed that morality doesn't apply to art. As another example, morality is often seen as trumping law, so the inference from law to morality on this assumption would not be justified. For example, if somebody says that something is legal and therefore says, well, therefore it's moral, in general, though, the idea is that if something is morally evil, then even if there's a law, say, allowing it, the law would be wrong. An excellent example of this in the United States would be something like, slavery during that era. Even though it was legal, it was eventually, clearly shown that it is immoral, and the law was thus overridden. So that brings us to the end of mixing norms, which exist to transition from one area to another. And that brings us to the end of part 1 of ethics.